So thank you so much, everyone, for coming along today, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me. I'm going to focus my remarks on this escalating new Cold War, since, for one thing, it's such an important component of international relations in the 21st century. Really, it's kind of the defining component. Secondly, it's so closely linked up with China's development. And lastly, I think it's particularly important for those of us in the West to understand and to struggle against. So one thing we should get out of the way is, what is a Cold War? You know, if this is the new Cold War, what was the old Cold War? And is there any connection between them? Is there any continuity between them? The term Cold War originally started to be used in North America and Western Europe shortly after World War II to describe this increasingly tense relationship between the capitalist world and the socialist world, and particularly between the two so-called superpowers, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was a war in the sense that there was a systematic pattern of hostilities that included every type of military pressure, you know, a network of military bases, numerous proxy wars, as well as sanctions, propaganda, destabilization, and so on. But it was a Cold War in the sense that it never actually involved the two sides being, you know, formally speaking, in a state of war against one another. Although, to be fair, for an awful lot of people around the world, the Cold War was plenty hot enough. You know, if you're in Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, there were some decidedly hot wars that took place within an overall context of the Cold War. So, according to mainstream history in the West, the Cold War was an ideological struggle between the US and the USSR, between capitalism and socialism, or in their terms, between democracy and autocracy. And the West won, so thereby proving that capitalist democracy is the best and that we've now reached the end of history. But actually, if you look into it, the Cold War wasn't about ideology at all. It was about imperialism. And it's really important that we understand that basic political dynamic, because it also applies to the new Cold War. What the Cold War really represented was a long-term, worldwide struggle on the part of the US and its allies to preserve and to expand the imperialist world system. And, you know, that doesn't reflect any particular evil or psychopathology on the part of the people that were engaged in that struggle. It's simply a function of the economics of modern capitalism. Capitalism brings with it an inherent tendency towards expansion. And at a global level, that means seeking to exert control over the greatest possible quantities of land, natural resources, cheap labour, and markets. And, you know, and that's precisely why historically the development of capitalism went hand in hand with the development of the colonial system. And all the major capitalist countries in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries went about building colonial empires: Britain, Spain, France, Portugal, Holland, Germany, and then later Japan. Now, in the 20th century, this process of colonial expansion was disrupted by a number of things. Firstly, as Lenin noted in his book on imperialism, by the first decade of the 20th century, or, you know, around 110 years ago, the division of the world among the major powers was essentially complete. And from that point, colonial expansion by one power essentially meant colonial contraction by another power. That is, you can only expand your colonies by going to war. And that was, you know, as you'll know, the key underlying factor of World War I. Second factor is that 1917, the Bolsheviks take power in Russia. That's expanded to Ukraine, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, thereby cutting off this massive territory of the Soviet Union from domination by the imperialist powers. Third factor is that then after World War II, you have the expansion of the socialist camp to include much of Eastern and Central Europe, China, the northern part of Korea, the northern part of Vietnam. And then also after World War II, the anti-colonial struggle gathered this unstoppable momentum throughout the global south, in no small part due to the support and the inspiration of the socialist camp. So from Ghana to Indonesia to India, Algeria, Jamaica, colonies won their independence. And as independent countries, they had some options. You know, they didn't just have to shift from a colonial status to a neo-colonial status. The existence of an alternative, the existence of a relatively strong socialist camp, meant that they could get the loans, the resources, the aid, the trade they needed without having to give up their sovereignty. So the sum total of all these factors meant that for the leading imperialist powers, the portion of the world available for domination shrunk. And throughout this period, in the meantime, the US emerged as basically the uncontested leader of the imperialist world, right? Particularly after World War II, Europe was in ruin. The US was able to establish the dollar as the basis for the global financial system. It set up NATO, it set up military bases throughout Europe and the Pacific. So the Cold War then was about consolidating, defending, maintaining and trying to expand this imperialist world system with the US at its heart and with Western Europe and Japan kind of brought in as junior partners. And it was a hybrid war against the socialist world and also against the forces of national liberation, against the global south, against the very idea of multipolarity, as we call it now, and kind of democracy, inequality and international relations. And the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the coups and support for these vicious military dictatorships in Indonesia, in Brazil, in Chile, in Guatemala, propping up apartheid regimes in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Rhodesia. All of this was connected to the long-term global struggle to bolster and consolidate US-led imperialism and had nothing to do with a so-called clash of civilizations. So that's the basic geopolitical character of the original Cold War. And the reason to talk about it is that there's a lot of parallels with this new Cold War. And in fact, in many ways, I think you can see one as being a continuation of the other. The Cold War ended with the collapse of European socialism between 1989 and 1991, and that was supposed to be the end of history. We were supposed to be enjoying a peace dividend by now, which never actually turned up. What we actually got was a new era of militarism, with the US asserting its renewed domination over the world with these devastating wars in Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya and Syria. And throughout this period, strategists in the US and its allies were pretty explicit about the need to maintain hegemony, to not allow any other country to reach a superpower status and potentially challenge this new status quo. Paul Wolfowitz famously said in 1993, "Our strategy must focus on precluding the emergence of any potential future global competitor." And the obvious competitors were Russia and China. But in the 1990s, neither of them seemed particularly threatening. Russia had a very pro-Western government that had kind of embraced American and European capital. Economically, it was in tailspin. And as for China, it was growing, but it occupied a space more or less at the bottom of the global economic hierarchy that the US was very happy for it to occupy. China was providing low-cost labor and making a lot of Americans very rich. So from a Western point of view, the idea was that China would continue to fit into this version of globalization that was defined by and directed towards the basic interests of the US and its allies. A global hierarchy with the US at the top, Western Europe and Japan, just one level down, and China, a long way down, somewhere near the bottom. Obviously the big flaw of this plan was that no one consulted China. And meanwhile, China's rapid growth has continued uninterrupted. And the character of its whole economy has been in a process of constant change. Wages have continued to increase steadily for over 40 years, as has China's advance in the realms of science and technology. Then, with the global financial crisis, China turned out to be the main driver of global economic growth. And instead of remaining just a destination for foreign investment, China increasingly became a source of foreign investment, and meanwhile becomes the number one trading partner of the majority of the world's countries. I think China's the major trading partner of about 140 of the world's 200 countries now. And furthermore, all of this was happening not under the sort of tutelage and support of the US, but within the framework of China's own homegrown strategy. And worst of all, led by shock and horror, a communist party. It's one thing for the so-called Asian tigers to be economically successful, since they've been given massive support from the US as part of the original Cold War and part of this geopolitical competition with the socialist world. But for a socialist country, for China to be successful with its 5-year plans and its state-owned enterprises and its Communist Party-led government and its own forms of democracy, etc., all this falls well outside the limits of acceptability. So that was then the context for Obama's pivot to Asia from around a decade ago, which is really a preliminary campaign of the new Cold War that meant increased US military presence in the South China Sea, It meant determining the THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System in South Korea and Guam, and establishing a military base in Darwin and so on. But at least during that period, during the Obama period, there was also some level of sensible cooperation between the US and China. For example, the Paris Climate Agreement came about in no small part due to the coordination between those two countries. Trump, on the other hand, dropped the cooperation and ramped up the confrontation. You know, Trump's big campaign promise from the beginning was, we're going to stop China raping our economy. He said that China was engaged in the greatest theft ever perpetrated by anyone or any country in the history of the world. So his administration kicked off a trade war, which is still ongoing. His administration launched a global campaign to cut Huawei out of various countries' 5G infrastructure. They sought to ban WeChat and ban TikTok. Trump and Pompeo revived the idea of the Quad, this quadrilateral security dialogue, which was a strategic alliance of the US, Japan, Australia, and India, and which Pompeo actually described explicitly as an Asian NATO. Anti-China propaganda reached a point where it was actively and is still actively feeding into anti-Asian racism and discrimination domestically, particularly when Trump insisted on referring to COVID-19 as the Kung flu and the China virus. So you'd think it would then be a big relief for the world when Biden was elected. Unfortunately, Biden has followed a basically Trumpian position in international relations. He said it very clearly early on, from the beginning, China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, and that's not going to happen on my watch. One of his first major foreign policy initiatives was to set up AUKUS, which is a security pact and nuclear-powered submarine deal between the US, Britain, and Australia. As a result, between AUKUS, NATO, and the Quad, there's now a sort of global military infrastructure of the new Cold War. And this military infrastructure targets China, it targets Russia, it targets Iran, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. Biden's really doubled down on the propaganda aspect, making these ridiculous and actually completely irresponsible claims about a supposed genocide in Xinjiang. And the US has become very active trying to spread these slanders as well, like coordinating with Canada, coordinating with Britain, Australia, and the EU, imposing parallel sanctions on China, and so on and so forth. So Biden isn't going back on the new Cold War. He's following the same positions as Trump in relation to China, Cuba, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua. And he's got support for that throughout the political system. The Cold War is bipartisan. And the situation in Ukraine currently is a manifestation of that. Whatever one thinks of Russia's current military operation and escalation, the underlying dynamic behind this conflict, which is an ongoing conflict and which didn't just start a couple of weeks ago, is this hybrid warfare to consolidate and strengthen US-led imperialism and to oppose the forces of multipolarity and multilateralism. That's why NATO has to expand. That's why AUKUS has been set up, why the Quad has been reactivated, why China has to be denied access to advanced semiconductor technology. It's about recognizing that China, Russia, other key countries aren't just going to be absorbed into the so-called liberal international order, and therefore trying to contain them, trying to weaken them, trying to destabilize them, and it's ultimately preparing for the possibility of waging war against them. So just to finish off, this new Cold War can do extraordinary damage. It's not just a hypothetical threat; it's a actual and existing threat. Cold War tensions can easily develop into violent confrontation. Cold War can become hot war, and we're talking about nuclear powers here. And rather than military escalation, rather than military bases and warships, the world actually needs the major powers to cooperate on nuclear disarmament and the construction of a lasting peace. The other existential threat we face is climate breakdown. Climate change affects everybody, and it's got to be solved at a global level. Physics doesn't discriminate. Cold War is standing in the way of the US, Europe, China, Russia, and others from cooperating to prevent climate breakdown, to contain the pandemic, to prevent future pandemics, to tackle microbial resistance. We face a whole host of global problems that require global solutions, and the new Cold War absolutely stands in the way of that. So opposing all forms of this new Cold War, be it the military aspect, the propaganda aspect, the economic aspect, the diplomatic aspect, is an absolutely essential part of our political activity. Thank you.